not natural for a dog to be wearing a harness. Okay, when you start them off, if you're going to start your dog and you're going to actually use him for this, just put the harness on. Just get used to having short sessions with the dog, putting the harness on and taking it off, and let him get used to that. Okay, when I started my dogs and learning, I started at about 4 months. And I would put little harnesses on them, and I would just let them walk around all day with the harnesses. Okay, that way they get used to having that harness being put on them as well as taken off. The next thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you do not put weight on the dogs if they're still a puppy. You're not going to put any weight on those dogs until after their hips are set at about 18 months. Okay, what I suggest you do is to put little sections of rope so that they get used to something that's behind them. Again, it's not natural for a dog to have something trailing behind him. Okay? He'll get flustered, he'll get nervous, he'll bite at the harness, he'll bite at the line if you go to put too much, too fast on a dog. You want to always make sure that when you're doing your training exercises, you start on a good note and you end on a good note. Okay, a little bit more about that later. Hey, buddy.
All right, so let's take a little break from outdoors, and what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to clarify what I was talking about with the lines with a dog sled. It's kind of hard to do, obviously, when I'm down to one dog. So we're going to discuss it on the whiteboard, and I'm going to show you different sets of hitches that people have used over the years. If you look at the board here, you're going to see, here's my sled, and what I was talking about is that is that center line that's right here, or the gang line. These are your tug lines, and they will go to the rear, obviously, of the harnesses of your dogs. One other line that comes into play is a neck line that's used to keep the dogs from veering basically off the center line and stopping. You will sometimes get dogs that will want to stop and sniff when the other ones are still going, so this will actually help keep them all in line when they're going. And traditionally, this is one of the most basic ways to hook your dogs up to the sled. Another way that was actually used, which was more prevalent in the early days of sledding, is they would use tracers, or what's known as a tracer, on both sides of the harness, and they would put their dogs in a single file situation. This way you didn't need to actually have necklines because the dogs were held in by the tracers there. So that would be your second. Lastly, what's basically used by the Eskimos or the Inuits or the Arctic indigenous peoples, this was known as the fan hitch. This lent itself very well to open, wide, flat ground. And as you can see, all the dogs are just basically tied off to the center of the sled, and they would just go on off. They weren't held together. They constantly would jump back and forth in between lines and things of that nature, and they would figure out their pecking order as to, you know, who was going to stand by who and everything else. And this way, you also ran into the susceptibility of having more dog fights. You know, one may get a whiff of the other one and he doesn't like them, and you know, then the fight is on, which is something that's actually common. The sled obviously is, you know, tied here in the back, lent itself more to using a sledge, basically spelled S-L-E-D-G-E. They were long, very heavy, and wide, and there wasn't any real steering except for the commands that were given to the dogs.
Alright, so that's a very brief discussion on sledding, dog sledding. When we talk about dog sledding, I know everybody thinks about the Iditarod, they think about the Yukon Quest, and they think about the long sprint races and the endurance races. And you know, you see a lot of dogs in a team. You see anywhere from 16 to 12 to 10 to 8 dog teams, where if you're a recreational musher, at the bare minimum that I have run dogs, I've had a team of 2 dogs. That's what I started off with. At my zenith, I had 5 dogs. Okay? You can run a team, a very small trapline team, but you have to realize something. You, as much as you are the master and as much as you command respect from the rest of the pack, you are still part of that team. You have to help the dogs. You don't ask your dogs to do anything that you wouldn't do yourself. If they're going up a hill and they're pulling that sled up a hill, you better be pushing behind that and not having them drag you up that hill, because it's not fair to them, because then they get tired out, and if they're too tired and they don't want to do it and they're not having fun, they're not going to pull you. Trust me from experience, if a dog does not want to do this job, the dog is not going to do this job. So make sure you're part of the team and do what you need to do. Now let's go into the next area, which is actually more applicable for most people because they probably have 1 or 2 dogs. And we're going to start talking about how you can use a dog with a small toboggan to carry your gear.